I've always been someone who followed the rules. It wasn't something I ever questioned, it was just how things were. My family, like most families, had expectations. They were clear, straightforward, and unspoken, but everyone knew them. I was the eldest son, the one who had to set an example, keep the family name intact, and follow the path that had been laid out for me. Success was defined by what I could achieve, not by what I wanted, and what I wanted didn't matter as long as it didn't stray from the course. My parents had their lives mapped out for me before I even understood the weight of their plans. They raised me with a certain set of values: hard work, discipline, and an unyielding sense of duty. Family reputation, education, and career prospects were the pillars of our existence. There wasn't room for deviation. There wasn't space for personal whims or desires. If I ever had doubts about that, I was quickly reminded of the importance of upholding the family legacy. I was in my late 20s when I first met her, my wife, though I didn't know she would become that at the time. She was everything my family disapproved of. Wild and carefree, with no real regard for any of the expectations that had been drilled into me. And I couldn't help but be drawn to her. She had this way about her, a kind of energy that made the world feel less rigid, less defined by lines that couldn't be crossed. It was refreshing. We met at a local cafe, a place I used to frequent to escape the suffocating world of my parents' expectations. I was there for the quiet, for the anonymity, for the chance to breathe in a place where nobody knew who I was. She walked in like she owned the world, like she didn't need anyone's approval, and, for reasons I couldn't explain, that felt like freedom to me. Her name was Hannah, and she wasn't from the same world I was. She had a small apartment, worked 2 jobs to make ends meet, and seemed content with her life, despite not having what people around me considered success. To her, success wasn't defined by a degree or a big paycheck, but by the little joys in life: good coffee, honest conversation, and the chance to explore new things. I found that intoxicating. I found her intoxicating. I tried to ignore the growing pull I felt toward her. I knew what my family would say if they knew about her. They'd never approve. She wasn't from the right social circle. She didn't come from money. And she had no interest in fitting in with the traditional expectations my parents had set for me. But, despite my best efforts to resist, I kept finding myself drawn to her. As we spent more time together, I started to feel like I was living 2 different lives. With her, everything felt alive and unpredictable. With my family, everything was expected and well-worn. I was playing my role, and it wasn't a choice. It was a duty. But when I was with her, I started to forget that duty. When I finally told my parents about Hannah, I braced myself for the inevitable disapproval. I had known it was coming, but nothing could have prepared me for the coldness in my father's eyes when I mentioned her name. He didn't say much, but I could tell that in his mind, I had already made a mistake. My mother was more vocal about her disappointment. "Why couldn't you find someone more suitable?" she asked, her voice sharp with concern. "Someone with your background, your prospects." But I didn't care. For the first time, I didn't care about their approval. I cared about Hannah, and that was enough. The more I fought for her, the more the walls between my family and me grew. They didn't understand my choice, couldn't see beyond the narrow vision of success. But I did. I saw something in her that I couldn't ignore, something that made everything else feel trivial. It was like finding a way to breathe again after years of holding my breath. I married Hannah quietly, with no fanfare. I didn't want the judgment, didn't want to put my family in a position where they felt forced to pretend they were happy for me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just about their approval anymore. It was about what I had found with her. It was about choosing my own happiness for the first time in my life. When Hannah told me she was pregnant, I felt a wave of joy unlike anything I had ever experienced. The thought of becoming a father stirred something inside me, something I hadn't realized was missing in my life. I couldn't wait to be a part of our child's world, to guide him and watch him grow, to share in the love and chaos of fatherhood. We moved to a small house in the suburbs, away from the watchful eyes of my parents, and built our life together. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. We had a rhythm, a quiet, contented rhythm. I started to imagine a future that was different from the one my family had envisioned for me. With Hannah by my side, I could see a world where we didn't need approval, where we could be happy on our own terms. And then, one day, our son was born. His name was Benjamin, and from the moment I saw him, I knew that everything had changed. He was tiny, fragile, but he held my heart in his tiny hands. I couldn't believe I was responsible for this little life. But at the same time, I felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. This was what I had been waiting for, what I had been searching for: this family, this love, this future. But my joy was tempered by the growing distance between us and my family. They refused to meet Benjamin at first. When I told my mother that we had a son, She barely reacted. "I'm sure you're both very proud," she said coolly, before changing the subject. My father was worse, he didn't even ask to see pictures. The silence between us grew heavier, and for the first time, I wondered if my decision to marry Hannah had truly severed my relationship with my family. They didn't just disapprove of my wife anymore, now, they rejected our son too. The more time passed, the more isolated I felt. The rejection from my parents was palpable, and no matter how many times I tried to make peace with them, it was never enough. There was always something about Hannah that they couldn't accept. They made it clear, time and time again, that their love for me was conditional on my choices fitting within the narrow definition of success. I tried to focus on my new family, but I couldn't shake the feeling of abandonment. I saw Hannah becoming more withdrawn, more hurt by the coldness of my parents' refusal to acknowledge her and our son, and while I wanted to be strong for her, I couldn't ignore the gnawing sense of guilt and shame that came with my family's rejection. We had a small group of friends, but no real family support. Benjamin's birthdays were quiet, and the holidays, once a time of family gatherings and shared meals, became a reminder of what we didn't have. Hannah began to question whether it was worth fighting for a relationship that seemed so one-sided. I couldn't blame her. I was beginning to question the same thing. The pain of being torn between the family that had raised me and the family I was building grew sharper every day. The tension between my wife and I became palpable, like we were both holding our breath, waiting for something to shift. But nothing did, and I was starting to realize that nothing ever would. The tension in our home had been building for months, but I tried to hold on to the hope that things would somehow improve. I kept telling myself that my family would come around, that they just needed time to accept Hannah and Benjamin. After all, they had to see how much I loved them. Right, and love, I believed, was supposed to be enough to mend any rift. But with each passing day, the distance between my family and me grew wider. I couldn't ignore the fact that my parents had not once asked to meet Benjamin. Their refusal wasn't just about my wife anymore, it was about the life I had chosen. The life that didn't fit into their rigid box of what success was supposed to look like. And the silence between us was suffocating. At first, it was subtle, a missed phone call here, a holiday invite I never received there, but as the months dragged on, it became impossible to ignore. My parents didn't just disapprove of Hannah, they were indifferent to our entire life together. To them, Benjamin was just another reason to reinforce their notion that I had made a grave mistake. I had stepped off the path they had so carefully planned for me. And in their eyes, there was no coming back. It wasn't just the emotional distance that began to tear at me. It was the lack of support. Hannah had been my rock, but even the strongest of us can feel the weight of isolation after too long. We were both exhausted, emotionally drained, and worn down from carrying the burden of not being accepted. I could feel her pulling away, not because she didn't love me, but because she couldn't continue fighting this battle alone. We had become two strangers in the same house, living side by side but never truly seeing each other. The cracks in our relationship deepened as I grew more consumed by my attempts to repair things with my family. And she began to wonder if it was all worth it. I could feel her frustration building, and it was almost as if we were speaking different languages. I still couldn't fully understand what she was going through. I was still, at my core, the man who craved my family's approval, the man who believed that if I just tried hard enough, everything would return to normal. But normal was slipping away. One night, as I lay awake beside her, my mind racing with everything that had happened, Hannah turned to me. Her voice was barely a whisper, but the words struck me like a lightning bolt. "I don't want to fight anymore. I'm tired of this," she said, her words hanging heavy in the silence. "You're not the man I married. You've lost yourself in their expectations. And I can't keep pretending everything's fine when I see you tearing yourself apart." I had no answer, no defense. She was right. After all, I had been so focused on what my family wanted that I had forgotten who I was. I had forgotten that I was a father now, that I had a family of my own, a family that needed me not just as a husband and a father, but as a person who could stand on his own, apart from the legacy and the expectations that my parents had burdened me with. "I'm sorry," I whispered, but it felt hollow, because what I really needed to do was something I had never been brave enough to do before. I needed to choose between my family and the life I was building with Hannah and Benjamin. Then, a few weeks later, something unexpected happened. I received a call from my mother, an actual, real phone call, which was unusual because most of our communication had been limited to obligatory texts and occasional cold emails. Her voice was tentative, hesitant, but there was something different in it this time. "We've been thinking about things, and we'd like to meet. Your father and I, we want to talk. To see you, and your family." At first, I thought it was a mistake. After all these months of silence, why would they suddenly reach out now? Why would they want to reconnect when all they had shown me was disappointment and disdain? I tried not to get my hopes up, but part of me couldn't ignore the possibility that things could change. Maybe they had finally realized how wrong they had been. Maybe they were willing to put aside their rigid beliefs for the sake of their son and their grandchild. Hannah was less convinced. She had endured so much years of rejection, months of hurt, and she didn't want to set herself up for another round of emotional turmoil. But I begged her to come with me. I wanted to believe that, after everything, there was a chance for healing. So, we decided to go, for Benjamin's sake, if nothing else. I wanted him to grow up with the possibility of a relationship with his grandparents. Even if it wasn't perfect, the idea of reconciliation seemed too appealing to ignore. The day arrived, and I couldn't shake the nerves. I dressed in my best clothes, as though to somehow bridge the gap between the family I used to know and the family I had become. I kept reassuring Hannah that it would be okay, even though a small part of me was terrified. What if this didn't go the way I hoped? What if it was just another attempt to manipulate me into conforming to their expectations? When we arrived at my parents' house, the air felt thick with tension. My father sat in his usual chair, his expression unreadable, while my mother hovered around, her nervous energy palpable. There was no warm embrace, no apology for the months of silence. Instead, there was an uncomfortable stiffness that hung in the air. "I'm glad you came," my mother said, though her words sounded rehearsed. "We've had time to think, and we've realized we may have been too harsh." For a moment, I allowed myself to feel hopeful. I wanted to believe that this was genuine, that they were finally ready to make amends. But as the conversation progressed, I began to feel a growing unease. The more they spoke, the more I realized that this wasn't about reconciliation. They hadn't changed. This wasn't about making amends. It was about control. My parents weren't trying to heal the rift between us, they were trying to manipulate me into accepting their way of life again. The truth hit me like a ton of bricks when I overheard a private conversation between my mother and father while I was in the kitchen. They weren't discussing how they could build a relationship with Hannah or Benjamin. They were discussing how they could convince me that my life had been a mistake. They wanted me back in their fold, not because they truly loved me, but because they had always believed that they knew what was best for me. The same beliefs, the same manipulations, that had haunted me my entire life. I felt betrayed, deeply, completely betrayed. All this time, I had hoped that things could go back to the way they once were. But there was no going back. They didn't want a son who was free to live his own life. They wanted a son who would return to their control, to their world, where every choice I made had to be approved by them. That night, after we left my parents' house, I couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of betrayal. I looked at Hannah, who had been quiet the entire time, her eyes filled with hurt and disbelief. She had known from the beginning that this was how it would end. And she was right. I couldn't live in a world where my family's love came with strings attached. I couldn't raise my son in an environment where his worth was determined by his ability to meet someone else's expectations. The next day, I made the hardest decision of my life. I called my parents and told them that I couldn't continue to be a part of their world. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay when I knew it wasn't. I had to choose my family, the one I had created with Hannah and Benjamin, over the one that had never truly accepted me. In the days that followed, there was a strange kind of peace that settled over me. The weight of the decision was heavy, but it was also liberating. I had walked away from a life that wasn't mine, and in doing so, I had found a new sense of purpose. I looked at Hannah and Benjamin, and I realized that this was where I belonged. This was my family, and though the pain of cutting ties with my parents was real, I knew that it was the right thing to do. There would be hard days ahead, there always are when you make life-altering decisions, but I was no longer afraid. I was no longer torn between two worlds. I had chosen the one that mattered. I had chosen the people who loved me for who I was, not for what they wanted me to be. As I watched Benjamin play in the yard, I knew that I had made the right choice. For the first time in my life, I was free to be the father I wanted to be, free to love my wife the way she deserved, and free to live without the weight of others' expectations.